is conducted on the current conflict. And this is Betul Dogan Akkash from Ankara, and I will be moderating this session on behalf of Al Sharq Academic Center. And we have three distinguished guests from different parts of the world and from different disciplines. And our primary focus today to discuss a conceptual base for ongoing conflict, ongoing war, which we will be discussing the concepts of ethnic cleansing, the disproportionate warfare, and harming of civilians, basically. And we will be also talking on the role of US in this ongoing situation and how Western powers are reacting it, what to expect from regional powers. Are we going to see an active regional involvement diplomatically? So this will be a brief but quite comprehensive discussion. And I would like to introduce you our guests. The first one will be Ms. Sarah Lee Whitson. She is the Executive Director of Democracy for the Arab World Now, and she has published widely on human rights and foreign policy of the Middle East countries. And she is someone from the perspective that she was always following the information in the ground, connecting it with the global and local politics in the Middle East from a human rights perspective. And we are so happy to have her here. I wish we could meet in a better, for a better reason. But I would like to start with Ms. Sarah, and what we would like to hear from you in the first session of, the first round of our discussions. How do you approach the ongoing questioning of human rights violations in Gaza, the ongoing ethnic cleansing, disproportionate warfare? We are approaching a moment where the societies in the Arab world are shocked by the violations of human rights. Last night, we were all shocked seeing a hospital bombed by Israel. Although there are still ongoing allegations that they say we didn't do it, but we also have seen many informations from the ground that came from the Israeli territory. So how do you approach to this, and what do you see as an outcome for human rights violations and ethnic cleansing in Gaza? Floor is yours, and there you go.
Thank you for organizing this. What we're seeing in Gaza, and of course, initially in this round of violence in southern Israel, is wide-scale violations of international humanitarian law, or the laws of war. Currently, Israel is not only indiscriminately bombarding Gaza, saying it's targeting militants, but in fact, indiscriminately massacring civilians living in residential areas throughout northern Gaza, but also southern Gaza. It has also imposed a total siege, a total blockade, really just tightening the screws of the blockade that's already in place to restrict the provision of electricity, of fuel, of water, of food and medicine, and creating really a humanitarian catastrophe for the people in Gaza. There have been some mild statements of concern and mild suggestions from Western powers for Israel to respect the laws of war and to avoid endangering civilians. But I think these are just throwaway lines because the outcome of Israel's operations is entirely predictable. And there isn't anybody who's observing this and has observed Israel's past bombardments of Gaza, of Lebanon, of parts of the West Bank, that doesn't know the pattern. And the pattern is not only indiscriminate attacks on civilians, but also deliberate attacks on civilians deemed to be sympathetic to their enemies, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah. We also have seen deliberate targeting of journalists and medical workers, hospitals. Israel has, again, as it has in past wars in Lebanon and Gaza, stated that it is giving civilians warnings to flee. And what it does is, once it gives its warning, it pretends there are no civilians left. But in fact, the reality is civilians are not able to flee, and even civilians who have been fleeing have themselves been bombarded. Numerous convoys of Palestinians fleeing to the south of Gaza have been hit, in addition to ongoing bombardment in the south of Gaza as well. What is very important at this point, I think, are two observations, one positive and one negative. One positive observation is that what is very, very different, in addition to the scale and magnitude of the devastation that is underway and promised to continue in the coming days with a ground invasion, is that the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction and is conducting an investigation into war crimes and crimes against humanity and other violations of the Rome Statute in Gaza and Palestine. This is extremely important because this opens to liability not only the Israeli officials participating in this war, not only Hamas officials who've committed atrocities, but also Americans who are providing weapons and assistance to the Israeli government under charges of aiding and abetting. It is well established in international law. It's well established under the Rome Statute that providing aid and assistance, aiding and abetting the commission of war crimes makes one liable for charges. And so this opens up American officials to criminal liability, individual criminal liability. I think it's extremely important that anyone who's closely monitoring the ground helps compile evidence and information about what's happening. The ICC just today put out a statement inviting people to submit evidence. That is quite important. The less optimistic observation I have, and this is really looking beyond what's happening in Gaza, looking to Ukraine, looking around the world, where we see just wild disregard of international law, international humanitarian law, whether you look in Sudan, whether you look in Ethiopia, whether you look in Xinjiang, in China. And the question that I'm left with is international law dead? Because laws have no meaning unless they're enforced. And if the champions of international law and order, most prominently the United States, are here in this conflict encouraging the war criminals, supporting, aiding, and abetting them. And sadly, this is something that we've been watching in Yemen, and we've been watching in Iraq, and elsewhere in the Middle East, to say nothing of the rest of the world, for so long. It's just, I really fear that we're entering a very, very dark place, and that there are some powers that would rather see international law crushed and destroyed and shredded and thrown away than to impose compliance with international law on Israel.
Thank you, Sarah. Let me summarize your points. As you mentioned, we have seen mild suggestions from Western powers, although we had already settled international decisions from International Court of Justice, Criminal Court, and although we know internationally those movements by Israeli army are not, no way they are acceptable. We have seen them in the ground, and the disinformation, ongoing disinformation about the situation in Gaza is actually, although it is not acknowledged by the authorities in the Western part of the world, we also don't see a proper diplomatic reaction to prevent any further devastation, which might be even more after a ground operation. This is promised by Israeli army. And I would like to continue with the same perspective, focusing on international law and the concepts of ethnic cleansing and disproportionate warfare, and what to expect from international law, or as Sarah asked, is international law already dead when it comes to suffering parts of the world? And we would like to continue with Dr. Triestino Mariniello. Please excuse my accent. And he is He is a professor of law at Liverpool John Moores University, and he is a member of the legal team representing Gaza victims before the ICC. So, Dr. Floor is yours, and as Sarah already started, we would like to hear more from you about international law. And firstly, I also would like to learn. So we have this information going on in social media by official Israeli accounts from army, from foreign ministry, declaring some information which, according to people in the ground who live in Gaza, who are part of the resistance movement, they say this information is not correct. We don't have an international committee verified this information, but how do you approach this spread of disinformation from official accounts, and how do you approach from what's going on at the moment from a perspective of international law? Thank you.
Well, so first of all, many thanks for the invitation. It's quite a lot. I will try by this brief, speech to stick to the 5 minutes I've been allocated. But of course, for any questions and request of clarification, I'm here to answer. Well, I think that first of all, addressing this situation in Palestine, in Gaza specifically from international law perspective, means first of all addressing the context. Something which is missing so far from the main discourse. I refer mainly to the mainstream news, but also to the comments provided by a good number of scholars on social media, but not only in these past few days. The context is crucial also from an international law, international criminal law then perspective. And the context here we are discussing is that of a Gaza Strip, which is still under occupation, despite the withdrawal of the disengagement of the Israeli troops 16 years ago. Under occupation because after that, in these past 16 years, the Israeli authorities have continued to exercise an effective control over the Gaza Strip. In other words, limiting the freedom of movement, limiting every access and exit from the Gaza Strip, controlling every aspect of the life of the residents in Gaza. There is increasing number of international organizations arguing that the occupation, Gaza is not only occupied, but that the occupation under international law is illegal. I'm referring in particular to the reports of the UN Commission of Inquiry or to the reports of the Special Rapporteur for the Human Rights Situation in Palestine. In legal terms, this means that the occupation itself, so the context itself, can be argued amounts to a widespread and systematic attack against the civilian population, which means a crime against humanity under international criminal law. So the hostilities, the conduct of hostilities, the violation, to say it better, we are discussing today, have to be assessed in this context. Context and the violation cannot be addressed separately. That's the point. So we can't forget what's going on in Gaza in the past 16 years and the impact that the blockade has on the Gaza Strip, in which 97% of the water is unfit for human consumption, or in which 58% of the population depends on humanitarian aid. This means that the total warfare declared by the Israeli authorities a few days ago have to be assessed in this specific context. And total warfare means serious violation of international humanitarian law and most likely a war crime, the war crime of starvation under Article 8, depriving civilian population here of essential goods. And it also may amount to a crime against humanity of extermination because put in place within the context of a widespread, as I mentioned before, systematic attacks against the civilian population. Sarah was mentioning before the indiscriminate attacks. This is not a novelty. Well, what we are assisting now, the novelty is the scale. But if you look at the previous Israeli wars against the Gaza Strip, they have always been characterized by indiscriminate attacks. So violation of the distinction principle under international humanitarian law, one of the pillars of international humanitarian law, so not making a distinction between civilians and military objects, and at the same time a war crime. So the direct, deliberate attacks against civilians and civilian objects, so schools, hospitals, religious sites, and we could go on for a long time. Another serious violation of international humanitarian law we've been assisting in these days, and again, this is not a novelty according to the IDF conduct of hostilities, is the disproportionate use of force. So disproportionate attacks against civilians and civilian objects. And well, to conclude this brief list, I will say, but this will be much longer, will require much longer time than I have today. Even the evacuation order issued by the Israeli authority itself is a serious violation of international humanitarian law. And in any case, if civilians do not comply with this order, this does not justify any attacks. It has been, in my views, correctly argued that the evacuation order in this context of widespread and systematic attack against civilians may amount to the crime against humanity of forcible transfer. And if the civilian population should be deported to Egypt, so out of the Palestinian territory, that would amount to deportation. I think, and I will conclude this first part here, that international law is clear. International humanitarian law, international criminal law are clear here. What is problematic, and that, again, it's not a novelty when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian setting, it is implementation. We are assisting again and again to a selective implementation of international law, of international humanitarian law, international criminal law, and this is the most problematic part here. The idea that when it comes to Israel, so to the Israeli-Palestinian setting, there must be an exceptionalism so that specific alliances with Western state can provide a derogation from international law. That's not true. As Sarah was correctly saying, I mean, third states have obligation. Individual could be also be criminally liable, but I would add something else. Third states here, well, including the US, but not only, I mean, EU states, of course, they have not a political discretion in deciding whether to put an end to the hostilities, but they have a legal obligation under international law to support all those lawful means provided by international law to put an end to the serious violation of international law. And here, for lawful means, I mean, I refer to the work of the UN, in particular of the Commission of Inquiry, to the work of the International Criminal Court, to the possibility to issue some sanctions or to establish an interposition force in the specific context in order to protect civilians. Thank you.
Thank you. The more you give information to us, the more I have questions in my mind when it comes to the role of international law and ICC when it comes to the situation in Gaza. And what you said is actually taking us to the point that I will ask to Omar Rahman. You mentioned about the context of the war, which is an ongoing situation, which has trends, which has ongoing violations of human rights, but also the current situation. So what we see now in the media and by the Israeli authorities, because Hamas started this on the 7th of October, the international community or the media or the intellectuals around the world, there's this questioning of the legitimacy and justice of representation of Hamas Palestinian. I mean, not only the Palestinian Authority in Gaza, but the ones they also supporting Hamas in Gaza. So there is this conflict or dilemma going on when it comes to regional states approach the Palestinian cause at the moment. Are they doing it because they are supporting the bloc or political understanding that Hamas represents, or are they doing it for a humanitarian cause which is ongoing and devastating at the moment? So I would like to continue with Omar Rahman, who will be briefing us more on the regional aspect of the warfare, and he is a fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs in Doha, and he is also the editor of FGAR, which is an online publication of insights and analysis on the region, and he is also a non-resident fellow at Becker Institute for Public Policy. So but we would like to hear from you, Omar. How do you see the situation from a regional perspective, but also when it comes to the role of US? I mentioned about the allegations over Hamas and the representation or questioning of Hamas legitimacy in Palestine. This is not something new, I know, but how do you approach the current situation when it comes to bringing context and current violations together. How do you see the Biden's visit in US, and are we going to see an active diplomacy from the regional countries? Floor is yours.
Thank you, Betul. There's a lot of questions wrapped up in there. Certainly, I think from a U.S. perspective, or maybe I think it would be helpful to take a quick accounting of what the U.S. position has been so far and what the U.S. has done so far in terms of looking at its role in this. And I think, if we look at the past week or from October 7th, the United States has, and Biden in particular, has pledged unconditional support for Israel to take whatever action it deems necessary. And that's irrespective of international law. We've seen some kind of questioning sometimes in the US media narrative. And that's very rare of what it means, especially after all the devastation we've seen wreaked on Gaza. And there's been, a willingness both in Europe and the United States to say, well, Israel can really do whatever it wants. Maybe it should pay attention to international law, but that its siege is okay, as if those things can happen at the same time, because the siege is itself illegal. It's collective punishment of the Palestinian population. So that's one thing. The United States has sent warnings to the rest of the region not to get involved in this. It has a manifestation of that. It's sent a naval strike force into the Eastern Mediterranean region, ostensibly to keep the rest of the region, Hezbollah, maybe Iran in particular, at bay from getting involved in this. But also that has an effect on the psychology of Israel, which is to kind of say you have carte blanche to conduct this assault in any way you see fit, without having to worry about the casualties sparking some kind of response in the region. And it's also issued directives to its own diplomats, to its State Department, not to speak about a ceasefire, not to speak about de-escalation, not to speak about restoring calm to the region. And it's sent its own diplomats. Obviously, Secretary of State Blinken, has just been in the region for a week, meeting, going in 10 different places, not to produce a ceasefire, but to kind of keep U.S. allies in line with the U.S. and the Israeli position on this. So I don't think, when Biden now is heading to the region today, there's nothing to indicate that his visit is to push for ceasefire or to caution any type of restraint on the part of Israel. But I don't think, Israel is really taking its cues from the United States in that regard. Its position is important, but this kind of blanket support is intended to give Israel carte blanche to do whatever it wants. And that's having, obviously devastating effect as Israel kind of levies absolute carnage on the Gaza Strip. It's rapidly mounting civilians, destruction of civilian infrastructure, killing, obviously the bombing of the hospital we saw yesterday. All of that has an effect. But I think, one thing we've talked about here with the ICC, and I don't want to get into the international legal aspect of this, but I think Israel feels itself, and it has felt in the past, although it's been worried about it, but especially because of the support it's receiving in the West, it feels that it will be immune, I think, from prosecution. Its leaders will be immune from prosecution at the International Criminal Court because the United States and Europe have given really their full backing to this assault. When it comes to the regional aspect of this, I think that's been part of the concern of the U.S., and that's why Blinken has gone around to Saudi Arabia, to Qatar, to Jordan, to Egypt, to all these kind of countries to give the U.S. perspective here, to give the kind of the Israeli perspective, to caution allies from getting out of line. But ultimately speaking, because this is not going anywhere, even the assault on Gaza, this is likely to spread both internally within Israel-Palestine itself, and maybe regionally. There's a chance of that. But what Egypt's stance will be as Israel drives 1 to 2 million people towards its borders. The EU diplomats, Egyptian diplomats were telling EU diplomats, if this is your position on this issue, why aren't you taking 1 million people from Gaza into your borders? Why is it incumbent on us to do that? And so what this will mean ultimately as this crisis unfolds for Egypt's peace treaty with the Israelis, for its positions there, what will Jordan's position be, especially if this turns into a wider conflagration that kind of erupts in Jerusalem and the rest of the West Bank. Jordan already canceled its summit that was going to be held with Biden yesterday. So will their peace treaties remain intact? How about the normalization agreements that have been forged over the last couple of years? And also, again, how will the anger that's erupting across the Arab world, affect the positions of the governments in this region? Could we even see this turn into, merge with the seething kind of anger at the economic crises in all these countries, at the political crises in all these countries, seethe into another outbreak of a kind of Arab Spring type uprising? So there's a lot of variables here in terms of the regional consequences of what's happening now. And again, we haven't seen the end of it. This is likely to really get much worse.
Thank you. I wish we had more positive interpretations on this, but because this is the fact on the ground, our interpretations are also oriented to that. So we are moving to our second round, and if you have any questions, please you can write on Twitter and YouTube and the question box here. I will be reading them at the end of the session to our presenters. And we would like to continue with Sarah, and we have the problems of human rights violations, and we have also the problem of accountability of Israel. So are we gonna see at any stage that these things happening at the moment will be internationally or in a transparent way, let's say, putting on, will be in front of us, in front of public? Because what we see at the moment is a situation where we don't have a proper conversation between leaders when it comes to human rights violations. What they focus on is at the moment the day of attack by Hamas, 7th of October. And because this is the focus, we can't see a change in their narrative. So my question is to Sarah, how do you approach practical outcomes of UN or European Union or any other Western power that might have or reach a solution or a quick ceasefire in Gaza? Do you have any scenarios in my mind that might bring a ceasefire? Do you see any practical outcomes that might come from any of these institutions or leaders? Because at the end of the day, although it is now at the moment an issue between Israel and Gaza, as Omar mentioned, we might see a regional effect or implication. So please, floor is yours, and we would like to hear more on anything you would like to from the previous discussions.
Yeah, sure. So as we were discussing previously, the most imminent, practical, and possible forum for accountability is if the International Criminal Court proceeds with a robust investigation, if it deploys investigators to Gaza. The prosecutor deployed 43 investigators to Ukraine right after Russia invaded. It has so far deployed none to Gaza, though the investigation has been underway for 4 years now. How possible is it that they'll proceed? I don't know. I'm sure the ICC will continue to face even worse threats and sanctions from the US, from the UK, from Israel for choosing to pursue the investigation. But at the same time, if the ICC fails to proceed on this investigation, it will be the end of the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court is already on very shaky grounds. Its credibility is already under serious question. A number of African states have withdrawn from the court, seeing its failure to prosecute any Western powers or allies of Western powers. If in the face of these atrocities, the ICC still does nothing, the consequences will be very grave for the court's future existence and survival. There is a UN Commission of Inquiry. It is seized of the matter. It was appointed before this conflict began. It is going to be investigating this situation. I think it actually just completed its report, but I read that they are going to resume their investigation. I really don't know, but as everyone here may already know, these sorts of Commission of Inquiry investigations or Human Rights Council investigations sadly have no enforcement mechanism whatsoever. The UN Security Council is really the only body that can pass a resolution calling for a ceasefire. Yesterday, even the so-called humanitarian ceasefire, a temporary ceasefire to allow for sick and wounded to be removed and food and medicine to come in, that was rejected by the US, UK, Japan, and France, among others. In the prior conflict 2 years ago, the US blocked 3 ceasefire resolutions. Now, a few years ago, France did propose that the 5 permanent UN Security Council members abstain from vetoing on ceasefires and humanitarian ceasefires in the face of atrocities. I think that deserves some extra reinforcement and push at this time, at least not to veto, even if they just abstain. Ultimately, of course, there's going to have to be a ceasefire because there's no other end to this. And I doubt very much that Israel will be able to bring about the complete surrender of Hamas the way that Azerbaijan was able to do in Artsakh, for example. I think that the risk of regional conflict spreading is real. I just been tweeting this morning that I definitely believe Israel's goal to be to spread this conflict beyond Gaza, to go after Hezbollah in Lebanon and ultimately Iran. And it hopes very much to rope the United States into this and rope other Western states into this using the pretext of an anti-ISIS coalition. And that's why they've been characterizing and describing Hamas as being the same as ISIS. I hope that fails, something that none of us have had a chance to digest and think through yet. Is that the Iranian foreign ministers just landed in Riyadh to meet with the Saudi foreign minister. That is a very major development. I think that, ironically, sadly, tragically, however you want to call it, it is now Iran or Saudi who will be very important players in containing this crisis and at minimum keeping it confined to Gaza. That doesn't help the people of Gaza or the people of Palestine, of course, but at least it will save this from spiraling into more dangerous zones.
Thank you, Sarah. And your concerns about the spillover effect in Middle East, I guess we all share it, and I hope we won't see it. And I would like to continue with Dr. Triestino. And because you have a special position in ICC representing the humanitarian violations in Gaza, would you like to add more on this? What to expect from international community or ICC in general? Can you relate it with the EU or UN? As I asked to Sarah, do you see a practical scenario that might help to reach a rapid ceasefire in Gaza?
Well, thank you very much for the question. I think that also in this regard, I mean, we should remind everyone that the formal engagement of Palestine with the International Criminal Court started in 2009, not 2 years ago when the prosecutor opened the investigation. So we're talking of 14 years ago. In 14 years, there has never been any concrete effective measures taken by the International Criminal Court. For effective measure, I mean at least the beginning, the investigation of a specific case in this situation. The first time the investigation should have, in theory, concern crimes allegedly committed within the context of the military operation Castellet. But then the prosecutor decided to not decide. In other words, decided not to start an investigation because he didn't know whether Palestine was a state for the Rome Statute or not. We have to wait for the 2019 for the new prosecutor at the time, Bensouda, to conclude finally a preliminary examination and saying that there was, she had evidence to start a formal investigation. Investigation started in 2021. I mean, this decision to start an investigation in Palestine was welcomed by the victims in this situation in Palestine, and by civil society organization in Palestine with huge enthusiasm. Not because they are so naive to believe that the International Criminal Court is going to stop the illegal occupation in this context, but because there is no alternative for justice. There is no other available mechanism for justice. In theory, justice should come, first of all, at the domestic level, and also in light of the complementarity regime of the International Criminal Court. But we know very well that Palestine, for a number of reasons, is unable to prosecute, to investigate these crimes, in particular if committed by Israeli officers, and Israel is unwilling to, and maybe even the military justice system, even unable to address the serious violation of international law amounting to international crimes. Not because I say it, but because there are plenty of reports of international organizations, again, of the UN Commission of Inquiry, clearly addressing how the Israeli military justice system is put in place in order to protect, to shield alleged perpetrators of international crimes rather than bringing them to justice. And if you look at all the specific contexts we've been discussing about protective age, so the war in Gaza in 2014, no Israeli political or military officer has been convicted or at least prosecuted for international crimes allegedly committed in that context, despite the abundance of evidence, including also reports again of the Commission of Inquiry. If I'm not wrong, only 2 soldiers have been convicted in that case for the theft of a credit card, from Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip. This is to give an idea that there is no, when we talk about justice in this context, international justice in particular, there is no alternative to the International Criminal Court. There is no alternative because at the domestic level, there will not be any justice. So despite the rhetoric of some Western states or the mainstream media arguing that Israel has a capable and effective judicial system to address, to conduct independent investigation, that's very far from the reality. No, and we have clearly seen this in the case of Shirin Abu Akleh, that Israel has immediately shown its intent not to start any investigation. But that's not only the case of Shirin, it happens really all the time. We can make plenty of examples, for instance, those related to the Great March of Return. Let's go back to the ICC, and we have to say that unfortunately, so far, in particular, since the new prosecutor, Karim Khan, has been appointed in 2021, he's been very reluctant to advance this situation. I can provide really a lot of examples here, or elements, criteria, to support my statement. I can briefly, for a matter of time, refer to the budget of the court. In 2022, he allocated 0 budget to the investigation in Palestine. In 2023, he allocated the lowest budget to any active investigation before the ICC, 1/4 to 1/5 of the money allocated to the situation in Ukraine. As you correctly said before, so far, as Sarah correctly said, no investigator so far has been deployed. So what does this tell us? This gives us some important information. First of all, that not only we don't have cases in relation to this very shy investigation, because the scope of the investigation is very narrow. It excludes really a huge number of alleged international crimes committed against Palestinian civilians, but it also says us that there are no preparatory steps at the ICC for the selection of cases. That's the most concerning part, because there is no effective investigation. Without deploying investigators, there is no, and without money, let me say in this way, there is no effective investigation. And the prosecutor has been even very reluctant to say something, to issue some statements, also in these past few days. Only after a lot of pressures by civil society, international organizations, I'm referring to Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, he was still very reluctant. And is this the prosecutor's approach? The answer is no, because the prosecutor has not been so reluctant in other situations to address the commission of international crimes, the alleged commission. I'm referring to Ukraine. You will find plenty of statements, of visit, press conferences in Ukraine, and that's really laudable. I'm not challenging that, in which the prosecutor is clearly saying that he was monitoring. in the situation in Palestine, it's not only missing an effective investigation, but it's also missing a simple preventive statement, just sounding, giving an alarm to the parties involved, both of them, military Palestinian groups and Israeli authorities, that is monitoring, and every violation of international humanitarian law may fall within the scope of the investigation. Preventive statement that I have to say, in the past, when the prosecutor was Fatou Bensouda in the International Criminal Court, also had some deterrent effect. I remember in 2018, when the Israeli authorities were forcibly transferred a Bedouin community in the Area C, and the prosecutor issued a preventive statement, we are monitoring, and this could fall in our investigation, the Israeli authority decided not to proceed with the forcible transfer. And there was a statement by minister at the time clearly saying that this decision was taken following the position of the International Criminal Court. So it's really unclear from at least a legal perspective, from interest of justice perspective, why the prosecutor is so reluctant to focus on this situation. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we had a really detailed base for the questioning of international law and why we are not reaching a solution or a proper support from ICC because of all these issues about the enforcement, the budget, or the acceptance of their role in the internal issues, or maybe regional issues yet as well. So in this part, I would like to move with Omar Rahman, and in the initial stage, you gave us a brief discussion on the role of US, and you also mentioned briefly the regional implications. But I would like to hear more from you, because today we have seen world leaders, like regional leaders, to join Organization of Islamic Cooperation, urgent meeting in Jeddah. We have seen the Turkish foreign minister, and we have Iranian foreign minister. We have other regional powers. And what I see at the moment, all GCC countries, but mostly Saudi Arabia and Qatar, they are really involved to reach a ceasefire. And more than before, we see Iran involved peacefully with the other GCC states. So how do you approach this regional or sub-regional efforts? Do you think they will be somehow have pressure on the European powers who are completely supporting Israel? So this is the first question. The implications or the sponsorship of regional powers, because Turkish foreign ministry said we would like to sponsor the peace on behalf of Palestine, and we would like to hear other allies supporting the Israeli side or sponsoring this side to have a peace process, proper peace process. And the second question for you is the societal aspect, because what we see from the last night, we have seen a tension in the Arab street. They are protesting, and because there has been also normalizations in the Arab world with the Israeli state. Do you see any implications of this social tension on the policymaking of the Arab states? Thank you.
Sure. I guess your first question is kind of the role of regional countries in terms of approaching a ceasefire. I think from the very start, yes, actually the only calls for mediation, calls for ceasefire, countries offering themselves to mediate was coming from the region itself, was coming from Turkey, was coming from Egypt, was coming from Qatar, was coming from Saudi Arabia, offers to mediate. And of course, those were disregarded completely by the Israelis. Israel was not interested in talking about mediation. It wanted to prosecute this assault on the Gaza Strip and this plan, I think, to eliminate Hamas. And they got the full support of their backers in the West. And so those offers of mediation have gone nowhere. So even countries, again, like Turkey, which obviously has a relationship with the Israelis and with Hamas itself, was unable to play that role because, again, Israel is not interested in going down that path, at least not at the moment. Whether that's going to have any effect in terms of pressuring European powers, I'm not so sure. I mean, we've seen very, very little from Europe or from the US calling for even tampering or tamping down what the Israelis are doing. From some pockets of Europe, there has been, but from Germany, from France, from the UK, from its primary backers, there's been very little in terms of calling for Israel to restrain itself in any particular way. And so that's been very dangerous, very reckless policy. When we look at Biden's visit to the region, and I said this before, I don't think there's anything to indicate that Biden has any intention of pushing for a ceasefire or restraint from Israel or calling for mediation in any particular way. If you want my honest opinion, I think what Biden is concerned about is legacy. I think he wants to be remembered by Israelis in this moment as the president that stood by them unwaveringly in the darkest hour since 1973. I think he looks longer term. He wants to be remembered by the Jewish people who have a very long memory, who care very much about their own history, as he wants to go down in the annals of Jewish history as that leader who stood by the Jewish people in its greatest hour, in its darkest hour since the Holocaust. When Trump was being remembered as the next Cyrus, I think Biden looks at it in that particular way, and he doesn't care about what the civilian costs are as a result of that. He doesn't care, I don't think, about the kind of regional implications of this. I think they're trying to prevent this from spiraling regionally, but I don't think Biden cares about that. I think he has a different point of view when it comes to this kind of thing, and so I don't think there's any intention of mediation at this particular juncture. The one thing I think is important to remember, this gets a little outside of your question though, is what is Israel aiming at? Israel has had a fundamental problem when it comes to the Gaza Strip for a very long time, for 75 years. But it has this large population, mostly of refugees within its midst, who are living in an open air prison, who are angry, who are upset, who are living in, who have been immiserated, and who want some kind of resolution of their issue. Israel has no intention of reoccupying and managing its occupation of the Gaza Strip. It's going to manage that occupation from the outside, as it's been doing since 2005. So it doesn't want to go in there. So it needs somebody to govern and, in effect, police the Gaza Strip. And that was, whether they liked it or not, Hamas since 2007. And Israel was willing to deal with that. And Hamas, in fact, served some beneficial purposes at least for Netanyahu, for his policy of dividing and conquering the Palestinian people. But from just a logistical point of view of managing and policing the Gaza Strip, Israel came to rely on Hamas. And to be honest, there has been no alternative. So we've seen this 5 times of bombing the Gaza Strip into submission. But ultimately, Israel has recognized that it needs someone in place that's capable of governing the Gaza Strip. This time around, because of what happened, because of the scale of the attack from Hamas against Israelis, there is this intention to wipe out Hamas out of the map. But that doesn't resolve the issue of who's going to govern these 2.3 million people. So if you take that logic of that to its sinister conclusion on the part of Israel, it's to eradicate the Gaza Strip. It's to push the people out of there and to change the fundamental dynamic that's been in place for 75 years with the Gaza Strip. And that is, has serious implications of ethnic cleansing, of genocide, of a second Nakba. And so what the ultimate outcome of that policy, if Israel moves forward with this, and from everything we can see, from the statements of its leaders, the dehumanization of the Palestinian people, the calls to flatten Gaza, to eradicate the strip itself, and the policies, the way Israel's conducting itself in its assault, we have nothing to believe otherwise, that this is not its intention. And that's going to have, again, a radical impact on the region that's seeing the videos, that's seeing the images come out of the Gaza Strip, and as well as the human lives that are lost, pushing people into Egypt, or at least if Egypt has to close its border to those people, it may pay a cost to its own people. We're starting to see protests for the first time in Egypt in the past few days and elsewhere. And so I think, again, when you ask about the societal aspect of this, the protests that are manifesting in the Arab streets, that can have real impact. We're not sure how that will evolve, how the Arab governments will deal with that dynamic, how they'll deal with their own people, whether they can manage those, whether they will spiral out of control. The Arab world, the Arab leaderships, the Arab governments have always had a big issue when it comes to people protesting in the street, and how to manage that, and whether those will spiral outside of their control. And so I think there are implications. We don't know what that's going to be, ultimately speaking, but there is, this is not the only issue that affects the Arab world. It is a reason people are angry right now, but there are other reasons, and those things can merge, as I said earlier, and explode in various ways. I hope that answers your question. If there's anything else, I can answer as well.
Thank you, Omar. I think what you said, it is not the topic of this webinar, but what you said actually quite related with the situation going on in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, where we have seen the same trends. Not protests, but same tension from the society. They would like to see a solution, but they haven't seen anything practical yet. So we have many questions in the chat box, and some of them sent me from the private chat. And I would like to combine them. And I have three primary questions for each of our speakers. And I would like to start with the first one. So Sarah, we have questions about the political regimes of the Middle East. So some of the participants are asking, since we don't have proper democratic rules in the Middle East, once these international partners, organizations, institutions, if they don't properly use international law or human rights to the Middle East when it is required for the sake of Middle Eastern societies, how then we are going to convince the regimes in the Arab world to be part of this human rights? Since we have many situations happening all around the Middle East, then what's going to happen for the sake of human rights in the Middle East? And I would like to add more. How do you approach that normalization? Do you see that UAE or Bahrain can cancel their normalization with Israel? This will be your last comment, so please add as you wish.
I don't see the role that Arab governments playing in this conflict as one that is fundamentally driven by their concern for the human rights of Palestinians or the lives of Palestinians. Forget about their rights. Maybe there's some kernel of emotional response that they've been conditioned to have, but otherwise their response is pretty clearly dictated by their political considerations. And so, for example, a government like Egypt, on the one hand, is seeing these popular protests, pro-Palestine protests, but frankly, I think it's allowing those protests to take place so that it can increase the cost that it's going to charge the United States to give them what they want with respect to Gaza. For example, any consideration to allowing refugees from Gaza to stay in the Sinai. That is going to have a big price tag, and the Egyptian government will play off of the popular protests in Egypt to extract an even bigger price for doing whatever it is that the US and Israel want them to do in this role. So no, I don't see their concern as one that is going, if I understood your question, to translate into better human rights for the citizens of the Arab dictatorships. With respect to the UAE and Bahrain, particularly for the UAE, it doesn't really have a native population to whom it must satisfy. There are a very small number of actual Emirati citizens, and none of them vote. But they are so integrated into the regime that it's, I think, very hard to separate Emiratis from their government. They're sort of really just a bunch of interconnected families that happen to rule over an incredibly wealthy set of states. But I do think that on a global scale, the UAE and Bahrain, which does have more of a local population to contend with, do have a lot of egg in their face right now for having signed these Abraham Accords, despite the recommendations of many organizations around the world, and I'm sure people from the region saying this is a bad idea, this is going to blow up in your face. Not only is Israel not going to make the least bit of concessions for the Palestinians, not that that was ever a central part of their negotiations, but it's going to get worse, and you're going to be the ones who normalized with Israel and emboldened them. Will they walk away from the normalization agreements? Not yet. I hadn't even actually thought of that. But certainly this war has put the kibosh, put a block on Saudi Arabia normalizing with Israel for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. We are going to move with Dr. Triestino as the question directed to Sarah about the human rights and the authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. We have a question in the chat box asking if we will see anytime any leader who is part of this human rights violations in Gaza or in Palestine, who will be in front of the court, either ICC or any other international court. Are we going to see any practical outcome of international law? And the other question, then if it is not functioning, if there's all these questions, then how we are going to, as I asked to Sarah, how we are going to convince, or international community is going to convince the regimes all around the world to make their society more oriented to international law, if it is not functioning somewhere, which is really, extremely important, like Gaza or any other conflict area in the world. If it is not functioning there, then how we are going to have it properly accepted by other regimes? So I hope these questions are clear.
Yeah, this question is clear, but would require, maybe days, maybe months to be addressed. I think I have 2 minutes, so I will just say, if we are going to see any serious, senior leader responsible for these crimes in this context brought to justice. I would like to be more optimistic also in light of my role, but I have to say that this seems very, very difficult. Even at the beginning of a case, so the selection of alleged perpetrators of international crimes in the Palestinian situation setting, appears difficult. The court, in particular, talking about the International Criminal Court here, is subject to incredible pressures when it comes to some specific situations. And we have seen how it ended up in Iraq, when the former prosecutor decided not to open an investigation, despite the abundance of evidence, in particular of alleged international crimes committed by the British troops. We have seen how it ended up in Afghanistan, when it was in particular in relation to the investigation against US nationals, particularly, with regard to the well-documented cases of torture committed against prisoners in Afghanistan by US nationals. Palestine, as I agree with what Sarah was saying before, is a great opportunity, not only for the victims and the Palestinian civil society, but this is a great opportunity for anyone who cares about international justice, for anyone who believes that real international justice applies to everyone, independently on the nationality and independently on the political alliances. So far, the International Criminal Court, I think, has taken part at this that I can define the game in selecting among perpetrators and victims on the basis of their nationality. If the court is really willing to restore its credibility and legitimacy, Palestine is really the great occasion for the court to show to anyone that it is able to withstand incredible political pressures and to bring justice independently, as I said, on the nationality, but just on the basis of the evidence where international crimes are committed. This has not happened yet. In order to have justice, it's crucial that the Palestinian civil society is put in a condition to do its job. In other words, to document the serious violation of international law taking place. If there is an investigation today, it's not because the prosecutor or the court has started an investigation, as I said before, but because in the past few years, there have been organizations in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, which have collected information, materials, all stuff that one day could be evidence before the International Criminal Court. Today, what seems very difficult, also for the future, to have justice in relation to what's happening, is that for the first time, Palestinian civil society organizations in Gaza are unable to document this serious violation. This never happened before. It's an unprecedented decision. I'm referring to the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, for instance, Al Mezan, that for the first time, they are unable to collect any materials, information, evidence in relation to what is happening. It did not occur in 2008-9, it did not occur in 2014 or in any other previous war. Without this work of documentation, it's very difficult to establish the truth and the responsibility in the future. It's unlikely that this, I think, is going to happen, but as I said before, this is really the only venue for justice left to the victims in this context. And supporting the civil society organizations here can be, or by anyone, can be really important to also have proceedings ongoing before or after. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Triestino. And we are moving to our last participant, Omar Rahman. So then what we have as post-war scenarios, the questions here asking about the two-state solution because of what happened in last week in terms of ethnic cleansing and genocide, the warfare. Is it really realistic still to believe that these two societies are going to live together, or is there any possibility to convince policymakers in Tel Aviv, in Gaza, in Ramallah to proceed with it? So we would like to have your opinion on this. And the second one, I also would like to ask you about the normalization. Do you see any cancellation of this policy from Abu Dhabi or Panama? So these are your last comments, so feel free to add more. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Regarding the two-state solution, I mean, the two-state solution is something that's been dead for a very long time. It's been infeasible or unfeasible for years and years. It's really only discussed by diplomats within the international community as a policy because it allows them to, when they're discussing that, to kind of ignore addressing the realities on the ground, to addressing issues of the denial of Palestinian rights, the denial of Palestinian basic security and freedom. And so the two-state solution is an international talking point, but it's very divorced from the reality on the ground. The Palestinian people and the Israeli people will continue to live together as long as there's not a ethnic cleansing and a genocide of those people. But for the foreseeable future, and from what has been for a very long time, that these two peoples will continue to coexist on the same land. Now, that's not existing as equals. You know, the Israelis have subjugated the Palestinians for 75 years on this land, and for 56 years of military occupation. And in Gaza Strip, 16 years of a repressive, brutal military siege of the Gaza Strip. So it's not, they're not living together as equals, but they both occupy the same land. And so they're ultimately going to have to find a way of living together. Or Israel's going to have to find a way of redressing Palestinian rights in order for there to be any kind of peaceful future between the two peoples. Regarding the cancellation of normalization agreements, you know, I kind of think like Sarah Lee on this. I don't necessarily see that in the immediate future. If you look at the peace agreements between Egypt and Jordan and Israel, Egypt's peace agreement has survived since 1978-79, and that's through, you know, ongoing occupation. It's through the Second Intifada, through the First Intifada, through the many assaults and killings on the Gaza Strip. Israel has continued, or sorry, Egypt has continued to keep that intact because it serves its interests. You know, and it's not, it serves those interests as a priority above its any concern for the Palestinian people. Jordan has been the same. That's not saying those things are immune from falling apart. There could be conditions on the ground that finally kind of break, are the straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak. But for the time being, those agreements have been very resilient. And I think when it comes to the normalization agreements, these weren't taken in in a rush without thinking. The Emiratis and the Bahrainis and the Moroccans, to some extent at least, know that there's an occupation in place that has not come to an end. Whether they were thinking this through, as Sarah Lee said, a lot of people were warning them, hey, this issue is not going anywhere. Yes, you can look at the Palestinian people today and say, well, they're not really resisting. This situation is fairly stable enough. We can sign these agreements and pursue our individual national interests at the expense of the Palestinians. But many people, myself included, were saying that you're not really looking ahead. This issue is not only being resolved, it's devolving into something much worse. And there's a reason that the international human rights community and Israeli human rights community, Palestinian human rights community, has come to the conclusion that Israel has crystallized a regime of apartheid. And so if you're going to push forward with an agreement in which you're embracing the Israelis at this particular time, you're eventually going to be put in uncomfortable positions and potentially pay the price, especially in terms of public relations with your own people, with the rest of the world, just like those Western nations that are backing the Israelis to the hilt are paying the price in terms of how they are viewed in terms of the rest of the world. And, this issue, especially what we're seeing today in Gaza, is exposing the United States and exposing Europe for hypocrisy, for double standard, for it's been unbelievable, and that was already happening. It's been happening for a long time on the Palestinian issue. I don't think anybody was believing that the United States and Europe were even-handed really when it came to this issue. But especially when we saw the war break out in Ukraine, you see a very stark dichotomy between the response of Europe, between the response of the U.S. When it came to Ukraine, in real time, contemporaneously with the response of them towards the Palestinians. And they're utterly different. And this kind of exposes the world, and they're saying, wait, what's going on here? And what's happening now in Gaza is doing the same in the starkest way possible, is showing the world that these countries that claim to uphold or to respect human rights, to respect international law, do it selectively. And if you're doing it selectively when it comes to the law, that makes it meaningless. You're hollowing it out. And that's what we're seeing. And that's what our human rights experts and our international law experts that spoke on this panel were saying, that we are risking, the international community is risking the collapse of international law. It's risking the collapse of the criminal courts that have been established over long periods of time to do what they were intended to do, which is uphold justice in the international system, to prevent war, to do all these kind of things. And we're doing that on behalf of Israel so it can, bombard and annihilate the Palestinian people. And that's been happening for 75 years, but I mean, it's happening today in a way that cannot be ignored any longer.
Thank you, Omar. These were really insightful comments, and I would like to say thank you to everyone who is listening us so far, and thank you, Sarah, Omar, and Triestino for contributing with their comments. And I hope we will meet again in better occasions for better topics. Wish you all the best and wish you peace to Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you.